On the surface, 4-year-old Leiliana Wright appeared to be just another child full of life. But behind closed doors, her world was one of unimaginable pain. In the months leading up to her tragic death, Leiliana's cries for help went unheard. Despite multiple warnings, her mother, Jerry Quezada, and her boyfriend, Charles Pfeffer, were supposed to protect her, but instead, they became the architects of her torment. As Leiliana endured hours of brutality, the system meant to safeguard her failed at every turn. But how could a child so young, so innocent, fall through the cracks of a system designed to keep her safe? This is the heartbreaking story of Leiliana Wright, a young girl whose life ended far too soon, and the shocking failures that led to her death. Leiliana Wright was born into a world already filled with instability. Her mother, Jerry Quezada, had faced her own struggles growing up, marked by a history of broken relationships and personal challenges. Jerry's life was far from easy, and she made decisions that in retrospect would shape the tragic fate of her young daughter. As a teenager, Jerry had been in and out of troubled relationships, but in 2015, she became involved with Charles Pfeffer. Pfeffer was in his early 30s, a man with a past, one that was steeped in criminal activity and violent behavior. He had a criminal record and a history of anger issues, but for reasons that would later be questioned, Jerry allowed him into her home, and more importantly, into her daughter's life. Jerry's relationship with Pfeffer wasn't the first time she had faced difficulties in her personal life. She had been involved with men who, according to friends and family, showed signs of violent tendencies. But her relationship with Pfeffer was different. Reports from those close to Jerry describe him as controlling and unpredictable, a man whose temper could explode at the smallest provocation. Despite knowing Pfeiffer's past, Jerry allowed him to move in with her and Leiliana. Their home, a small apartment in Grand Prairie, Texas, would soon become the place where Leiliana would endure unimaginable suffering. Leiliana's biological father, who had been separated from Jerry for some time, had always been concerned about his daughter's safety. He had tried to warn Jerry about the dangers of bringing Pfeffer into their home, but his concerns were brushed aside. He had even reached out to Child Protective Services (CPS), alerting them that his daughter was at risk and pleading for help. Over the years, he had observed his daughter showing signs of fear when around Pfeffer, and he noticed physical injuries that seemed inconsistent with typical childhood accidents. Despite his best efforts, CPS failed to act. The system, overloaded with cases and hindered by bureaucracy, did nothing to intervene. Leiliana's maternal family also grew increasingly concerned. Her grandmother, who lived in the area, made multiple attempts to contact CPS, describing her growing worries about Leiliana's safety. She reported that Leiliana had been left alone with Pfeffer for long periods, and that the little girl had started displaying signs of distress, like avoiding eye contact and being excessively quiet. But again, nothing was done. CPS closed several reports without taking the necessary steps to investigate further, leaving Leiliana in an environment that would only grow more dangerous. The pattern of neglect and abuse continued to escalate over the months leading up to Leiliana's tragic death. Neighbors who lived near Jerry and Pfeffer would later testify that they often heard loud arguments coming from the apartment. Some described hearing sounds of physical violence, but none of them ever imagined the extent of what was really happening behind closed doors. Some saw Leiliana in passing and noticed bruises on her body, but the excuses offered by Jerry and Pfeffer, claims that Leiliana had simply fallen or gotten hurt while playing, kept most of them from questioning further. As time went on, Leiliana became more withdrawn. She stopped playing with other children, and often appeared exhausted and sickly. She had been a bright, playful little girl before Pfeffer came into the picture, but now, those qualities seemed to fade away. The sparkle in her eyes was replaced by a look of fear and confusion. But to outsiders, this change went unnoticed or was misinterpreted as simply the result of a difficult phase. For Leiliana, it was anything but that. Her mother, Jerry, was fully aware of the tension in the house but chose to turn a blind eye. Despite witnessing Pfeffer's violent outbursts, Jerry continued to stay with him. Friends and family described her as a woman who had always sought love and stability, but instead of finding that with Pfeffer, she had found chaos and fear. When asked about Leiliana's injuries, Jerry offered explanations that were inconsistent with the severity of the bruises and cuts her daughter had sustained. But still, those who cared for Leiliana never fully grasped the danger she was in. March 12, 2016, began like any other day for 4-year-old Leiliana Wright, innocent, full of life, unaware that the world around her was about to change forever. For Leiliana, this would be the last day she would ever feel safe. Her mother, Jerry Quezada, had plans that day, leaving Leiliana in the care of her boyfriend, 27-year-old Charles Pfiffer. What should have been a routine day of childcare became the beginning of a horrific, unimaginable nightmare for the little girl. As the hours passed, Pfiffer, who was reportedly under the influence of heroin, lost control and the violence escalated. Reports from authorities later revealed that he began lashing out at Leiliana in ways no child should ever endure. His anger unleashed in cruel and disturbing ways, his methods becoming more extreme as time went on. Leiliana had no means of escape. Pfiffer first used a bamboo stick, striking the little girl with it. When that wasn't enough to subdue her, he grabbed a belt, whipping her repeatedly with it. It's almost incomprehensible, the idea of a man so vicious, so lost in his addiction, that he could turn on an innocent child with such ferocity. But the abuse didn't stop there. Leiliana was bound, her hands cruelly tied behind her back, rendering her powerless to fight back or even attempt to flee. The psychological and physical toll on a child as young as Leiliana would have been overwhelming. The room, the atmosphere, everything in that house on that day became a nightmare Leiliana would never wake from. The suffering she endured wasn't just physical but emotional as well. She was alone with no one to hear her cries, nothing but the terrifying sound of her own heartbeat and the cruel actions of the man supposed to care for her. When Jerry Quezada returned home that evening, she had no idea what she was walking into. She found her daughter in the darkest possible place, the closet. Leiliana, barely conscious, was locked away in that small, suffocating space. The scene was incomprehensible. Her little body, bruised and battered, barely recognizable, was a testament to the brutality she had suffered for hours. The heart-wrenching truth of that moment was revealed when Jerry tried to resuscitate Leiliana, desperately attempting to bring her back. But Leiliana's small body was already cold, too far gone from the physical and emotional pain she had experienced. Her mother's frantic calls to 911 were filled with desperation, panic, and disbelief. "Please, my daughter, she's not breathing," Jerry screamed as the reality of the situation settled in around her. The moment emergency responders arrived at the home, the scene they were met with was one of horror. Leiliana Wright, only 4 years old, lay unresponsive in a closet, her tiny hands bound behind her back. Her mother, Jerry Quezada, was frantic, having just discovered her daughter's lifeless body. The 911 call made by Quezada was filled with panic, her voice trembling as she screamed for help. When the authorities arrived, they could see the signs of abuse immediately. Leiliana's body showed clear evidence of trauma, bruises and marks from both blunt force impacts and prolonged restraint. But it wasn't just her body that told the story. The whole scene seemed to echo the darkness that had engulfed her life. The case immediately garnered attention. This was no ordinary crime. This was a tragedy that exposed not just the extreme violence inflicted on a defenseless child, but also systemic failures that had allowed such abuse to continue unchecked. The investigation began, and the police quickly focused on Charles Pfiffer, the boyfriend of Leiliana's mother, who was responsible for her care that day. But what they uncovered went beyond the abuse Leiliana had suffered in the immediate moment. The investigation started peeling back layers of a broken system, a failure of institutions that were supposed to protect her. The medical examiner's report painted a devastating picture of the extent of Leiliana's suffering. The cause of death was blunt force trauma, a result of repeated beatings over a prolonged period. Her body bore signs of being struck by multiple objects, including a belt and a bamboo stick. The autopsy revealed a series of injuries, some of which had occurred over days, weeks, or possibly months. Bruises, lacerations, and abrasions covered her body, evidence of the relentless violence she had been subjected to. The trauma wasn't just physical, it was also emotional. Leiliana had been neglected, isolated, and abused. and by the time her life was cruelly cut short, her body had endured an unthinkable amount of pain. The abuse wasn't just a one-time incident. It was clear that Leiliana had lived through days, if not weeks, of terror, fear, and neglect. Investigators could only begin to imagine the horrors she must have endured in her short life. The brutality of the attack left little room for doubt. This wasn't a moment of anger that spiraled out of control. This was a calculated, cold act of violence aimed at breaking a little girl who never stood a chance. As the investigation into Leiliana's death unfolded, it became evident that there were larger issues at play, issues that extended beyond the actions of Charles Pfeffer and Jerry Quezada. The case soon revealed major lapses in the child welfare system. Leiliana's family had tried to seek help, and there had been numerous warnings raised about her safety. In fact, Leiliana's paternal grandmother had been concerned about her well-being long before the tragic events of March 2016. She had reached out to Child Protective Services, urging them to investigate the living situation and safety of her granddaughter. But despite these concerns, CPS had failed to act appropriately. In 2014, the grandmother filed a report with CPS, expressing concerns about Jerry Quezada's ability to properly care for Leiliana. The report mentioned instances of neglect, inappropriate behavior, and signs that Leiliana may not be in a safe environment. But, despite the multiple red flags, the case was inadequately investigated. CPS workers did not follow up with the necessary urgency or thoroughness that should have been required for a child in potential danger. The grandmother's fears were dismissed, and nothing substantial was done to protect Leiliana. The system had failed her, and that failure became painfully apparent after her death. Other family members had raised alarms as well, but the response from CPS was either minimal or entirely ineffective. The system that was supposed to be there to protect children like Leiliana, who had no voice of her own, had let her slip through the cracks. The investigation into the mishandling of Leiliana's case led to public outrage and calls for reform within CPS. Leiliana's death shone a harsh light on the brokenness of the child welfare system, and many people felt that her death could have been prevented if only the system had acted on the numerous warnings. As investigators dug deeper into the events leading up to Leiliana's death, they began to piece together a timeline of abuse that revolved around Charles Pfeffer. Pfeffer had been in the home with Leiliana on the day she died, and it quickly became clear that he was the primary aggressor in the brutal assault. In the courtroom, prosecutors detailed the horrors Leiliana had endured at Pfeffer's hands. Witnesses testified about his behavior in the weeks and days leading up to the incident, revealing a man who showed no remorse and no empathy for the child he was supposed to care for. Pfeffer's actions were chilling. He had abused Leiliana, and yet he showed no signs of stopping. His violence toward her escalated, and as the evidence mounted, the prosecution built a damning case. Jerry Quezada's testimony was pivotal. Though she initially denied or minimized the abuse, the truth eventually came out. Quezada admitted that she knew about the violence Pfeffer was inflicting on Leiliana. She had witnessed it but failed to intervene. She was aware of the marks on Leiliana's body and the bruises, yet did nothing to protect her own daughter. In the courtroom, Quezada explained that she had been afraid of Pfeffer and had allowed him to control her life, and ultimately, the life of her child. But her admissions of guilt were too little, too late for Leiliana, who could no longer speak for herself. Pfeffer's defense team attempted to claim that Leiliana's death was accidental, that the injuries were a result of a tragic but unintentional incident. But the severity of the abuse, the premeditated nature of the violence, and the testimony from multiple witnesses refuted this claim. Pfeffer's actions were deliberate, and the jury had no choice but to convict him of capital murder. In October 2018, Charles Pfeffer was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in emotion as the judge read his sentencing. The judge's words were damning. Pfeffer's actions had been unfathomable, inhuman, and savage. For Leiliana's family, the sentence was bittersweet. While it couldn't bring her back, it was a small semblance of justice. Jerry Quezada was also sentenced to 50 years in prison for her role in the death of her daughter. Her sentence reflected the court's acknowledgement that she too had played a part in the abuse and neglect that led to Leiliana's death. Quezada's failure to protect her daughter was inexcusable, and the court made sure her actions were not overlooked. The case left a lasting impact on the community and the child welfare system. It sparked widespread public outcry and led to investigations into CPS's handling of the case. Several officials within CPS were fired or resigned as a result of their mishandling of the reports and warnings that could have saved Leiliana. The case served as a tragic reminder of the vital need for reforms in child protection services, and for greater accountability in ensuring that children are never again left in situations where they are at risk of harm. Leiliana's story did not end with her death. It became a symbol of the many children who suffer in silence, in the many cases where warning signs are ignored. Her tragic fate was a catalyst for change, sparking conversations about the failings of the system and the urgent need for reform. While justice was served, it did little to ease the pain of losing a young life, one that had barely begun to blossom. Leiliana Wright's legacy would forever be tied to the fight for better child protection laws and the need to protect the most vulnerable members of society. Leiliana Wright was just a 4-year-old girl with a life ahead of her, full of potential. But her future was stolen in the most horrific way imaginable. As her life was tragically cut short, her story became a devastating reminder of the dark side of the world, where those who are meant to protect the most vulnerable can become the very ones who harm them. The haunting reality is that Leiliana's cries went unheard, and the system failed her when she needed it the most. Her mother and her mother's boyfriend inflicted unspeakable pain, and the tragedy didn't have to happen. Leiliana's story doesn't end with her death. It serves as a call for action, a call for us to demand accountability from the agencies entrusted to protect children. We cannot allow another child to suffer in silence because of neglect, abuse, or systemic failure. As you reflect on Leiliana's story, ask yourself how many more children are out there, forgotten, with no one to defend them. What can we do to prevent the next tragedy? Let's not turn away from the reality that child abuse is still happening, often unnoticed. If this story has touched you, speak up, share, raise awareness, and support reforms that protect children like Leiliana. No child should ever suffer like this again. Remember Leiliana. Let her story inspire change and ignite the fight to ensure no more children are lost in the cracks of an imperfect system. Subscribe, share, and take action. Together, we can make sure her death was not in vain. Leiliana Wright's death is more than just a tragic end to a young life. It's a devastating reminder of how deeply flawed systems can fail the most vulnerable. Despite repeated warnings, the Child Protective Services failed to protect her from the cruelty that took place behind closed doors. Her mother, Jerry Quezada, and her boyfriend, Charles Pfeiffer, were supposed to be the ones keeping her safe, but they became the ones who inflicted the ultimate harm. The aftermath of her death led to public outrage, raising critical questions about how children are protected, and how many others are left to suffer in silence. While Charles Pfeiffer was convicted and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, and Jerry Quezada received a 50-year sentence, the pain left by Leiliana's loss is irreparable. Her story highlights the urgent need for reform, both in child welfare services and in society's responsibility to protect those who can't protect themselves. As we reflect on Leiliana's short life, we must remember the lessons it teaches us. No child should ever have to endure the horrors that she did. And it's up to all of us to ensure that her story is never forgotten, and that no child ever suffers the way she did again.